Okay, I think we're going to get started. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming back. I was slightly concerned I might have overloaded you yesterday, so I'm very pleased that you have come back for more today. Thank you. Is my volume all right for the people in the back? Yes? Good, excellent. Okay, so let's get started with our first case study. As I promised yesterday, we're going to have a series of case studies for the remainder of the week now. And our first one is set in Belgium, in Brussels, and we're going to be focusing primarily on Victor Horta, the famous Art Nouveau architect who was very active in Brussels. Now, Belgium, as an artistic context, I feel has been very understudied, especially in the Anglo-Saxon context. And that's a real shame because Brussels, Ghent, and Antwerp were really vibrant cities during the 1890s, and there was a lot going on. And especially in Brussels, we have the most avant-garde city in Europe at that time, because we have a very strong native school of symbolist painters and symbolist poets. And I just want to point out one of the most important symbolist poets, Maurice Maeterlinck, who, of course, was he was a Nobel Prize winner in 1911. He was given the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he epitomizes really symbolist poetry. He was obsessed with death and indulged in morbidity, which is very much a symbolist trait. And I think the most famous piece of his writing is probably The Blue Bird, but some of you might remember him from the Vienna class, because he, of course, also wrote The Seven Princesses, which was the influence or the point of departure for Margaret MacDonald's wonderful Cesso panel for the Warndorfer Music Salon in 1902. So symbolism is very important in Brussels, but we of course also have an extraordinary flowering of Art Nouveau architecture in the city. And as I briefly mentioned yesterday, this incredible flowering of the progressive arts in Brussels and in Belgium at large was very much connected to a particular group of artists known as Les 20, the 20. And Les 20, the group was established or founded, if you want, in Brussels in 1883. It went very strong for 10 years, and then, as is often the case with these kinds of artists' formations, people started to fall out with one another. They started to fight over aesthetic visions, over who got to hang their works where in the exhibitions. So it was a very conflict-ridden, but also a very dynamic group that then dissolved in 1893, but was picked up under a new name, the La Libre Esthétique, and I'll speak about that in a moment, which then went from 1894 to 1914. So we really have 20 years of an incredibly creative and experimental phase in Belgian art. And the chief aim of this group, of Les 20, as they originally founded themselves as, was to, on the one hand, provide progressive, forward-looking, avant-garde Belgian artists with a platform to show their works. So they organized exhibitions, and they had this wonderful journal, L'Art Moderne, in which they published critiques and treaties and poetry, etc. So they had an artist's journal. So that was one aim, to promote members of the group. But they also were very keen to expose Belgian audiences to the best of European and American modern art. So here we again see this kind of internationalism that I was trying to talk about yesterday, this interconnecting network of progressive artists, designers, and architects who are in exchange with one another across the continents. Now, Les Vins is very interesting because they did not actually promulgate or push a very specific artistic program. But as I said yesterday, they were very much interested in bringing together the most promising, the most modern, the most of their own time artistic forces from Belgium and abroad. And as is the case with so many of these artists groups that form in the 1890s, and I'm just mentioning the secessions in Berlin, in Munich, in Vienna, which had a very similar agenda, they very much reacted against the government-sponsored triennial salons that took place in Brussels, Antwerp, and Ghent. So it took place in a different city every year. And artists really were agitating to take their careers into their own hands. And in that sense, I think they very much modeled themselves on the Impressionists, right? Which is the group of artists who in 1874 first exhibited outside of the Salon in the photo studio Nadar. Now, as I said, it was a very mixed group. We have key figures such as James Ensor in this wonderful self-portrait I'm showing you here on the left, self-portrait with masks from 1899. And some of you might know Ensor's work, and he often painted these carnivalesque worlds turned upside down, and masks play a really important role in his work. We also have, and we saw a painting yesterday, Fernand Knopf, who's a key figure in Les Vins. But we also have lesser known and maybe even more traditional artists who are members. And I'm showing you here, or thinking about someone like Jean Delvin with this painting Ox Near a Fountain. And just to mention Ensor, there was a wonderful recent exhibition. It's literally closing this weekend at the Royal Academy in London, which showed Ensor paintings, but it was actually curated by Luc Tismons, and I hope I'm pronouncing this name correctly, who's of course a contemporary artist. He's often aligned with Marlene Dumas, who's of course the famous South African contemporary artist. So he curated this wonderful Ensor show at the Royal Academy that was very successful and critically highly valued. So the kind of international artists that were invited by Les Vins were also a bit of a mixed bag, if I may say. We have on the one hand individuals who are of course key figures in the European avant-garde, such as Paul Gauguin, and I'm showing you here his wonderful self-portrait with Yellow Christ from 1890. We also have Whistler being shown, but then we also have Les Vins inviting more conservative artists like Joseph Israels, whose painting Peasant Family from 1882 really kind of epitomizes his artistic practice. But important to us, thinking about international Art Nouveau, it wasn't all about painting, although of course the symbolists and the international Art Nouveau architects and designers had a close relationship with one another, actually a relationship that I think needs to be further explored by art historians. There's some work that really still needs to be done to tease apart the complex and complicated relationships between these two. But anyway, that's beside the point. Les Vins also exhibited decorative arts. They focused primarily on painting and sculpture, but because Henri van de Velde and Victor Horta were very influential members of Les Vins, we also have especially arts and crafts artists being brought to Brussels, and we have a very strong Belgian response to works, for example, by William Morris. I'm showing you his wonderful tapestry, medieval-inspired tapestry, Woodpecker II from approximately 1885. And then Walter Crane, whom we already met yesterday as the first president of the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, his iconic swan Russian iris design for a wallpaper. The other thing I wanted to mention about Belgium is that Belgium and France had a very close relationship with one another. Many of the radical intellectuals from France often found exile in Belgium. So, for example, when Victor Hugo had to flee after Napoleon III seized power in 1851, he went to Belgium. Or when Charles Baudelaire had to go into exile between 1864 and 1866, he also went to Brussels. So there's a very, one could maybe suggest that there's a very sort of receptive welcome to progressive, if not radical, ideas in Brussels and in Belgium. And of course, this interchange between France and Belgium is also part of or also comes about because of the close proximity between Paris and Brussels. And actually, a lot of Belgian artists end up studying and working in Paris. And Victor Horta is one of the figures who spends time in Paris before he sets up his practice in Brussels. So what I really want to emphasize here is that Belgium and Brussels, which is the context for Victor Horta's work that we're looking at today, was an incredibly dynamic, incredibly experimental, and very forward-looking artistic context, both in the visual arts, but also opened up the doors of the Les Vins exhibitions to the decorative arts. And I would certainly say that the decorative arts played an important role in the Les Vins exhibitions because of Victor Horta and Henri van de Velde. So this is Brussels roughly around 1900, and this is the urban context within which we need to place Victor Horta. Now, Horta worked as an architect and a designer during a period of large urban redevelopment in Brussels, and this urban redevelopment was initiated by King Leopold II, who had come to the throne in 1865. And I'm showing you here a photograph of him on the left-hand side. And this urban redevelopment scheme was in part financed by government money that he was given by Parliament, but it was also in part financed by his own private funds. And his pockets were deeply lined with money that he had acquired through his exploitations of the Congo. And I'm showing you here on the right a really wonderful caricature, actually, that was published in the British magazine Punch magazine in 1906. And it shows a Congolese rubber collector who is literally entangled, whose life is squeezed out of him by a snake that features the head of Leopold II. So in many ways, this large urban redevelopment initiated and financed by Leopold provided the kind of infrastructure as a city for new architecture to come up, to spring up. So one could say that Leopold put the infrastructure into place, and the middle classes, the industrialists, those who had come to money, populated these new urban spaces. And Leopold had very ambitious plans for his capital city. He wanted to build an elegant system of boulevards and avenues. And I'm showing you here a postcard of the Avenue de, and please excuse my pronunciation, Tervuren. which of course is the very site on which Joseph Hoffmann's Palais Stocklet is situated. But it's not the only avenue, but you can see how he really modeled his program on Haussmann's remodeling or regeneration of Paris from the 1860s onwards. So Baron Haussmann tearing down many of the sort of small alleyways and old medieval houses to make room for these very representative tree-lined boulevards. And it's along these kinds of boulevards that the new houses from the well-to-do, from the upper middle classes went up. And it's the architects such as Victor Horta who are starting to get the commissions for these kind of new houses. Now, Leopold himself was, as you can imagine, not a patron of the progressive arts or design or architecture. He only once decided to adopt International Art Nouveau for one of his buildings. And when he did so, he only did it for the interior presentation of a museum collection. So what I'm saying here in a very complicated way is, in his Musée du Congo, he, of course, it's a very typical Beaux-Arts historicist building, but the exhibition space designed in 1897 is the only site inside that Leopold actually commissioned architects from Art Nouveau like Paul Hanker or Henri van de Velde to design the space within which to set the objects that had been pulled out of the Congo. And you can see some of the Art Nouveau features in the trusses, for example, trusses for the ceiling here, in some of the decoration here in the panels. So it's a very mild, but it's a nod towards International Art Nouveau. But that's as far as he went in supporting this modern style. His favorite architect was this individual, Alphonse Ballat. And Horta actually trained with Ballat, so he is important to us, even though he was a conservative architect. And Horta indeed hoped that Horta would become Leopold's next royal architect. But this, unfortunately, did not materialize because Horta was a very difficult character, and he made so many enemies. He refused to collaborate with other designers, so that he basically moved himself out of any possibility to become the next royal architect. He did work with Ballat on this wonderful greenhouse development in Laeken. And this is actually an important early commission for Ballat and for Horta. And it's important because he learns to build in a way that then plays into his domestic architecture. So this is a set of greenhouses that employ, of course, the new technologies of cast iron and glass as architectural materials, but they also employ these new materials and new technologies for decorative purposes. And I'm showing you here the main glass and iron dome of the greenhouse. So again, what I'm trying to say here is this is an important project for Horta to have been part of, because this is where he, cuts his teeth, learns his skills, learns his trade of working with these new materials, with glass, with iron, with really industrial materials. And so with this with this position as the royal architect falling through, never coming to fruition, as well as a lack of forthcoming official commissions, Horta chose a different route. And he decided that he was going to cultivate a group of private clients who he would encourage to build, or to encourage to use him to build their new apartments along the avenues and in the suburbs that I just spoke about. So he opened his own practice in Brussels in 1890. And between 1890 and 1903, he designed 24 houses. So that was his most productive period, really. And Horta was very, very smart and very strategic. He joined the Brussels Freemasons in 1888. And that, of course, enabled him to establish a series of contacts to important patrons, such as the Tassels. We'll look at that house in a moment. The Solveys, another house we'll be looking at, the Winks and the Hallets. So he, of course, believed in the Freemasons and the sort of public good that this body was engaged in, but he was also very, very smart in sort of affiliating himself with the kinds of individuals that he wanted as his patrons. And I have this wonderful quote by Horta, where he talks in his biography about joining the lodge, the Freemasons. Quote, "After joining the lodge to devote myself to the public good, I, in fact, only made friends there with people whose profession prevented them from taking public action or taking an interest in political matters, and whose character led them to move more towards privacy and beauty than towards the masses and general vulgarity." Unquote. Very humble individual he is, isn't he? Because, of course, he's the one who will offer beauty and, privacy. Okay, so let's start looking at some of the houses that Horta designed for these patrons in Brussels. His first major client in Brussels was Emile Tassel, and he built a house for him, and he had met Tassel, as I just mentioned, through the Freemasons. And the Hotel Tassel, the Tassel House, was Horta's first independent building, and it was Brussels' first Art Nouveau building. Now, today, it's the seat of the European Food Information Council. That's a mouthful. And it's not open to the public, unfortunately. The building represents a key moment in Horta's development as an architect, because he used this early commission, 1892, 1893, to break free from the kind of historicist styles that revived a past that we looked at a little bit with the opera in Paris, for example, yesterday. And he was able to, by breaking free, create what he called, quote, a personal and living architecture. And by that he meant an architecture that was free of the laws imposed by past styles. And in this architecture, he used glass and iron, which, as I mentioned, he had learned his skill of using it in the greenhouses that he designed. He used this knowledge and applied it to a domestic space. And this enabled him to develop an entirely new type of facade. A facade that I would like us to think about as a rhythmic facade, as a facade that is not static, a facade that has a dynamism and an energy. And I think this is particularly carried, the weight of this dynamism, this rhythm, and this energy is, of course, carried by the bow window that you see right here. And I'm going to show you just a little detail right here, which is really one of the key features of the facade. And what Horta did here that was so revolutionary and that enabled him to build this personal and living architecture was that he laid bare the iron structure that actually enabled the window to become a bow window. Now, in terms of architectural or building techniques, the Beaux-Arts architects were very well aware of these kinds of cast iron skeletons almost of a building, but they would of course hide that structure. They would cast it into pillars, etc. Not Horta. He exposes the breast beam, which is this big beam. Think of it like a lintel right here, prominently. He doesn't hide it. He also, sorry, I got off mic, did I? Sorry. He also exposes, of course, the metal columns that support the structure and enable him to open up the space to have this big window, this big span of a wide opening. And he also shows the corner irons. Oops, sorry. Right here, the corners right here also lay exposed. Now, he needed all of this structurally to make that kind of a large opening, but he used it to his advantage, made it an aesthetic feature, made it something that was of beauty. It becomes a decorative feature. So it's, a modernist would say, it's a certain honesty to the structure of the building. So what's important about the Tassel house is that it is a building that for the first time in Horta's career introduces this kind of a curved line into his facade. Don't worry about the floor plan. I just wanted to show you one quick thing, because it's of course notoriously difficult to talk about the built environment when you're not actually experiencing the space. So the house, as you see it here, was really built in 3 parts. And this is why I have this plan here. We have a house, a brick house in the front of the plot right here. And then we have another traditional, conventional brick-built house towards the garden in the back. And the revolutionary thing that he did is he connected the 2 structures with a glass-roofed iron structure, a steel structure that he covered in glass. So this structure here served to connect the 2 parts of the building, but it also served to house all of the, what I would call, infrastructure. So it contained the staircases and the landings, so the means through which the users of the house could get to the different floors, the means through which they could move through the building. And Horta was very, very detail-oriented. He paid great attention to detail. And, you know, I said earlier he didn't like working with collaborators or with others. He was the kind of notorious micromanager who had to be in charge of everything. So he designed the door handles. He, of course, designed all of the ironwork and the woodwork. He designed panels and windows in stained glass, and I'm showing you here this wonderful stained glass window. This wonderful stained glass window at the top of the landing here. But he also designed mosaic flooring, which you can see here, as well as the furnishings, or some of the furnishings of the house. So he really created this total work of art that I was talking about yesterday. He integrated a lavish decorative scheme or lavish decoration with the general architectural structure. But it didn't mask that structure, and that's what was new and what was progressive about this building. Now he put the central staircase. So let's walk into the building just to orient ourselves. So on the left hand photograph is actually the entrance. So you can see you walk into this alcove, into this very protected space. It's almost like it's very Macintosh actually, or Macintosh uses that device a lot as well, and a lot of Glasgow buildings have that. It's almost like you're going from the exposed, open, busy street into sort of a cave-like structure. It's an important transition psychologically from the open, vulnerable into sort of a cocoon almost. So you enter through this door, which has a wonderful stained glass, organic floral bulb motif. And then you come onto this, so you come into the door, you go up one set of stairs, you enter this small landing, which has the mosaic. And you can see that really well actually in this drawing. So this is the door, you come in. It's the first landing. There is a waiting room here and a cloak room right here. And then this wonderful structure here, the staircase, is actually right here. And across from it is an empty space. And then you come up another set of stairs and you come to a door. And I'll show you that in a moment. So here we go. Does that make sense? So you got the entrance door. This is that round mosaic. To this side, you have that staircase with that wonderful arabesque design that we'll be talking about. You come up another set of stairs. You cross here, and then you get to this point. And this is really where then the brick structure starts again, the more private spaces. And these doors here that you can see, they're now glass doors only. They used to be stained glass doors as well. So as you transition from the entrance hall and the waiting area where you deposited your coats and you were waiting to be called, you gave your carte de visite and you were waiting to be called in, you could see another door. So the inner sanctum, so to speak, of the house was closed off, but it was stained glass. So it was this wonderful enticement. You could sort of see something through it. You had this wonderful colored light flooding through it, but you were still not part of the most intimate spaces of the house. And the house was built for family whose members like to entertain. So it was very important to make the entrance hall, on the one hand, as welcoming as possible. And again, as I just mentioned, Horta achieved that, I think, extremely successfully by combining the practical, i.e. the dropping off of your coats, the waiting to be shown through, with the aesthetic, with the beautiful, with the symbolic. Because it was such an open space that was flooded with light from the top. Remember, it was a glass roof, that it really was an open space. And it offered these vistas for the visitors to have all of this interest to look at, these interesting aspects of this space that they were in. And as I said, they were then called from the entrance hall into the interior of the house, where they then went through this set of double doors. Now, the most iconic, of course, photograph that comes out of the Tassel House, and that is reproduced in every discussion of modern architecture and of international Art Nouveau, is this wonderful staircase. Horta did not like enclosed spaces or solid doors. Because he felt that they really shut down circulation. They hindered the circulation of people, of air, and of light. And he believed very strongly that a staircase should not be a gloomy, imposing, ceremonious kind of space or structure. Instead, he wanted it to be lit. He wanted it to be inviting, to be used for a stroll through it. And for this reason, he introduced this light on top, this light well, and you can see the effect of this light filtering through from the top onto the staircase in a really lovely manner in this particular slide. So light and atmospheric effect was very, very important to Horta. And he constructed his clients' houses in such a way that he could take advantage of maximum light. And not just natural light, but stained light filtered through stained glass. So he was very keen to create these atmospheres, as I said. And remember, we were briefly talking about the total work of art yesterday, and it is this atmosphere that really brings together the built environment where all of the components, the furniture, the architectural structure, the carpets, the mosaics, all the ironwork, where all of that comes together. And if that is then bathed in a wonderful, warm, glowing light that comes in through a stained glass, you immediately have this aesthetic experience, an experience of beauty, an experience of something that's beyond the mundane and the everyday. And as I said, this was all made possible because he was able to use new technologies of, on the one hand, reinforced concrete, which was used by many other architects, but he, as I said, used steel construction and glass construction and left that open and exposed. So that had an important role to play in this total work of art. It was not just the skeleton of the building that was then clad over. It was left exposed. And another thing about Horta was that he really, and again, I think that comes again from his training and the work that he did in Laeken, he loved to build winter gardens into houses that he designed. And often they were right in the center of residences, and I'll show you a house in a little bit where you can see the winter garden right in the center. And the winter gardens weren't there to cultivate rare plants necessarily, but they were there to flood the space with light and to engender the kind of aesthetic pleasure and delight that I was just trying to describe in a little bit of a clumsy way, I think. So this building, the Tassel House, is a landmark for Horta, and it's a landmark for the history of Art Nouveau architecture. The floor, the ceilings, and the walls are decorated with arabesques. That's these things right here and here on the railings. And these kinds of arabesque echo the sinuous lines that I was showing you yesterday, for example, in Hermann Obrist's Whiplash embroidery. So this is bursting with energy. It's bursting forward. It's rhythmic. It's alive. It's organic. It's inspired by nature, because these arabesques are actually plant stems. Or he takes plant stems, think of briar roses growing all over, as his point of departure to abstract them into these arabesques, both on the wall and on his railings. And he famously said that he, quote, took from the plant the stem, not the flower. And I think that's a really lovely quote, because it sort of crystallizes a difference to French Art Nouveau, because the French Art Nouveau artists think about Émile Gallet, think about Guimard. They, of course, took the flowers, right? The flower was the driver for the French. So art historians have long compared these kinds of lines that I described with the kinds of color schemes and the absolutely extraordinary manipulation of color and light to Japanese prints. So Japonisme, as we briefly talked about yesterday. Oh, here's another photograph where you can see the plant stems. And it's actually quite a steep staircase, isn't it, when you look on the slide on the left-hand side? Because that's the staircase that actually then gets you up onto where the stained glass window is. Sorry? Did someone say something? No, sorry, I thought you said something. So art historians have linked that to some of the visual language that, of course, was very familiar to many of the progressive artists coming in through Hokusai prints, for example. I think it's a bit of a difficult argument, but I can see how it might work in the Tassel's house, because Tassel actually himself was an avid collector of Japanese art. So I'll just leave it at that, and you can make up your own mind about the link to a Japanese aesthetic. Okay, let's look at the Hotel Solvay, which he built between 1895 and 1900, which is a very different house from the one that I just showed you, the Tassel house. This was the home for Armand Solvay, who was the son of the chemist and industrialist Ernest Solvay. And Ernest Solvay is a really interesting figure, because he and his brother actually founded the Solvay company, and they patented the use of, or the production of sodium carbonate in the so-called Solvay process. So they basically made soda, late 19th century soda. And Armand, so the son of this set of brothers who had made a fortune in this process, in this company that they founded, he got married and he wanted to create a family home. And so he purchased a plot of land on the Avenue Louise to build this family home. And this is quite an unusual lot or plot for Brussels, because it is, as you can see, much wider than the Hotel Tassel, for example. It's actually 15 meters wide, which gave Horta much more space to work with than usual. His usual domestic commissions in Brussels are these skinny townhouses. And in his memoirs, Horta had the following to say about this commission. He wrote, quote, "I was received into that particular milieu because the audacity of picking me, a sure sign of energy and independence, demonstrated, albeit in a different way, the energy required by the Solvay brothers to invent their soda." Unquote. Isn't that a fantastic quote? Let's have a look at the inside. Very different space than the sort of stripped back, very, Tassel house. So I'm showing you here on the left-hand side the grand staircase, which starts out, so you come into the house through the door here, you come up a single staircase, and then the staircase in a very sort of traditional way splits off into two staircases. On the landing, you have a painting right here, so that would be sort of facing here. And then I wanted to show you again these stems, these plant stem-inspired railings for the staircase. And pay attention to this little bit here, because that is an absolutely amazing double fan skylight. So the facade really, it is this quite impressive facade, and it has these two symmetrical bow windows, but I would certainly say it gives no indication of the kind of spectacular and, to my view, almost a little bit over the top interior that it opens up into. And the house again was lit from the top by two light wells. One in the north, lighting the stairwell, and you can see that here. Remember I was saying, look at the little corner. This is the double fan skylight, stained glass lighting the grand staircase. And the staircase ends in the bel étage, where you have then on top that skylight. And a second light well then takes over from that space and illuminates the rest of the staircase and house, leading to the more private floors. And that's not as spectacular a skylight. So, and I'm sorry I don't have a photograph of that. So as the simple facade, or fairly simple facade, belies an extremely luxurious interior. And this painting right here is by Theo van Rijsselberg, the famous Belgian artist. It's called Reading in the Park, and he took a long time to complete it. It was completed in 1912, and he's a neo-impressionist painter who, you'll see in a moment, was extremely influenced by Seurat and Seurat's pointillism. Here are two rooms, the sitting room and the smoking room. They're both located on the bel étage. The sitting room being in the front and the dining room at the back. And I think you can see that the interior is very opulent, and that the sort of predominant color scheme is these warm oranges and burnt sort of caramel colors. And art historians have talked about this set of rooms as being a really successful interweaving of structure of the house itself, of forms, the furniture, the lighting, the paneling, all the details you see, and the color schemes that are used. So again, we're looking at a total work of art. And here is the painting that I was showing you earlier on the first landing, which is by, as I said, Rijsselberg. And the house itself, I think, employed a whole series of, maybe we can best see it here, of lush materials, painted decorations. Look at the carpeting of the staircase. So it is a much more luxurious and opulent house, I think, than the Tassels domestic spaces. And this particular house is still in private ownership today, although it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So what did Horta do with his own space, with his own house, when he built it in the Rue Américaine between 1898 and 1901? So this is now the Horta Museum. So those of you who have been to Brussels might have been there. It's accessible, obviously, to the public. So in 1898, Horta bought 2 parcels of land, again, double plot, on which he intended to build his house for his family and a studio, so his architectural practice. And I think the facade shows in a wonderful way the double function of this space. So the large windows on the second floor of the studio building, which is this part, are obviously the windows into his drawing rooms, not drawing room as in domestic space, but for the architectural practice. So this part of the house is where his business is located, and this is where he and his family lived. And I think it's nice that he actually made that distinction in the very facade of the building. The studio door is more narrow than the door into his home. So he made a lot of lovely, clever, very subtle, nuanced adaptations to really create this impression of 2 different usages of this quite large building. And the narrative of the house, of this space here, of the facade, is really one of an aquatic landscape. We have the protective grill. Do I ever learn? We have the protective grill of the windows here in the shape of grasses. We have irises, abstracted irises, as the design on the balcony right here. And then most wonderfully, we have these abstracted dragonfly wings on the balcony up here. Can you see? Like the Lalique brooch I was showing you yesterday. And here is the main staircase in the house. And I think I have another, yeah. So this is vertical alert. This is looking straight up onto, again, the cast iron and glass covered roof over the staircase. And here you can see the staircase, the culmination of the staircase. And here, look, he's using mirrors to actually make this quite narrow space look larger and opening it up. Here is the dining room. And it's a wonderful dining room. The walls are covered with white glazed brick, and it doesn't really come, and I've put on purpose these two slides because this one's way too yellow and this one's kind of pale. So imagine the sort of middle in terms of color scheme. But the brick that lines all of the walls, this is the garden, reflects the light in wonderful ways on a bright day. So it catches and plays with the light that comes in from the garden. The furniture is set into the walls. You can see these alcoves. For example, the dresser, the dining room dresser, set into this alcove, and that, of course, completely opens up the room, right? You don't have furniture projecting out into the space. It's receding back into the space, and the focus of attention really is the dining room table right here. And also have a look at the floor. He uses different kinds of marbles and woods on the floor. The floor is primarily oak parquet. I think that comes out very nicely in this slide. But the furniture is ash furniture. So again, remember how I was saying earlier, he always plays with different hues, with these warm colors. And I think in his employ of the woods and the veneers, that comes out very nicely. Here's another picture of the dining room. And here, so this is the dining room down here, and this is sort of an informal sitting room right here, and this is, of course, the staircase that we looked at already. Quick look at this house, because I just couldn't resist showing you this absolutely wonderful octagonal entrance hall. I think you get the idea, right? Entrance halls were incredibly important for Horta. Now, this house was designed for Edmund van Etwelde, and he was actually the administrator of the Congo Free State in 1895 when he commissioned Horta to build to design this house. And this is another house that's made up of two brick structures, so two conventional houses connected by a glass covered, in this instance, octagonally shaped area. It's not so much an entrance hall here, though. I would certainly consider it much more of a space for circulation. And I just wanted to show you, it's a shame it's black and white, but it's a historical photograph from the late 19th century, so you can see how it was, the kind of furniture that was in here, the plants that were in here. So while this photograph, of course, doesn't do justice to the wonderful play of light and the hues and the colors, it gives a really good sense of the structure of the space and these wonderful columns. Again, with the ironwork and these in the shape of flowers right here. So just to sum up, maybe we'll go back. No, we'll leave that one up. Horta had a preference for warm colors. Maybe we'll go to this space here. He used a lot of rose reds, honey yellows, ochres and orange tones in his schemes. He was also very particular about using fabrics to accentuate the color schemes that he had employed, and he actually often used Liberty fabrics in his houses. And he was really very committed to creating spaces that served as a retreat from the busy urban world. So that was really important. It was a space in which you could relax, where you could forget about all the stresses and difficult situations that you faced with in your professional and public life. So it was a space that, in its ideal manifestation, enabled the user to completely immerse themselves and to really tackle all of the senses. These light-flooded, wonderfully, quite human-scale spaces. And that's, of course, the idea of a Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk. Horta also immortalized nature in an intensely stylized manner. He was very fond of, as I said, the flower, stem, and the root motif, and we can find that motif all across his domestic houses. So I would really like to label him as the master of organic design. That harkens back to my inspiration I was talking about yesterday of nature being so important to Art Nouveau architects. But he abstracted nature, right? He used natural form, but he was interested in the underlying structures that one found in nature. And Horta also designed furniture and got furniture built. And I'm showing you here a fireplace and the bookcases from Van Etvelde's house. So again, every component of a space he was in charge of. And electric lighting was important, not just natural lighting, because of course we have evenings and we have winters. So he also thought very carefully about how to best deploy this new technology of electric lighting versus gaslight, which was still very much in use in many cities. And he attached this electric lighting to supporting structures that again are like these star-like sinuous lines. Can you see this here, for example? These wonderful interplay, again, between nature and technology, between artificial lighting and the organic. So he brings these contrasts together. So Horta was really a master of bringing together contrasting surfaces and materials, wood and metal, wood and marble, etc. And as I said, he was one of the first architects to use industrial materials and building techniques in domestic architecture on a large scale. And this allowed him to completely change what the buildings look like, and the facades in particular, because he was able to eliminate load-bearing walls on the interior, and he opened up the facades through these bow windows, for example. So the structure and the look, the structure and the core were closely and inextricably linked. And I'm going to close by looking at this ready-made brick lining of the walls in his dining room in his own home. Because one might certainly think that this was a cost-effective measure, possibly, because he could use these industrially produced materials. But what that, of course, doesn't take into account the incredible workmanship that is required. If anybody has ever laid any tiles in a bathroom or in a kitchen space, you know how difficult it is to line them all up. And Horta famously observed about his own dining room that, quote, "It would have been better to have constructed the whole of the ground floor in marble, because such great care was needed to fit the bricks," unquote. So I'm going to finish here for today, and tomorrow, oh dear, tomorrow we're going to look at Macintosh, and I was just going over the lecture this afternoon, and I have way too much material, so I hope we will get through some of this, but thank you for your attention today, and I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, I think we're going to get started. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming back. I was slightly concerned I might have overloaded you yesterday, so I'm very pleased that you have come back for more today. Thank you. Is my volume all right for the people in the back? Yes? Good, excellent. Okay, so let's get started with our first case study. As I promised yesterday, we're going to have a series of case studies for the remainder of the week now. And our first one is set in Belgium, in Brussels, and we're going to be focusing primarily on Victor Horta, the famous Art Nouveau architect who was very active in Brussels. Now, Belgium, as an artistic context, I feel has been very understudied, especially in the Anglo-Saxon context. And that's a real shame because Brussels, Ghent, and Antwerp were really vibrant cities during. And as I briefly mentioned yesterday, this incredible flowering of the progressive arts in Brussels and in Belgium at large was very much connected to a particular group of artists known as Les 20, the 20. And Les 20, the group was established or founded, if you want, in Brussels in 1883. It went very strong for 10 years, and then, as is often the case with these kinds of artists' formations, people started to fall out with one another. They started to fight over aesthetic visions, over who got to hang their works where in the exhibitions. So it was a very conflict-ridden, but also a very dynamic group that then dissolved in 1893, but was picked up under a new name, the La Libre Esthétique, and I'll speak about that in a moment, which then went from 1894 to 1914. So we really have 20 years of an incredibly creative and experimental phase in Belgian art. And the chief aim of this group, of Les 20, as they originally founded themselves as, was to on the abroad. And as is the case with so many of these artists' groups that form in the 1890s, and I'm just mentioning the secessions in Berlin, in Munich, in Vienna, which had a very similar agenda, they very much reacted against the government-sponsored triennial salons that took place in Brussels, Antwerp, and Ghent. So it took place in a different city every year. And artists really were agitating to take their careers into their own hands. And in that sense, I think they very much modeled themselves on the Impressionists, right? Which is the group of artists who in 1874 first exhibited outside of the Salon in the photo studio Nadar. Now, as I said, it was a very mixed group. We have key figures such as James Ensor in this wonderful self-portrait I'm showing you here on the left, self-portrait with masks from 1899. And some of you might know Ensor's work, and he often painted these carnivalesque worlds turned upside down, and masks play a really important role in his work. We also have, and we saw a painting yesterday, Fernand Knopf, who's a key figure in Les 20. But we are in the 1890s, and there was a lot going on. And especially in Brussels, we have the most avant-garde city in Europe at that time, because we have a very strong native school of symbolist painters and symbolist poets. And I just want to point out one of the most important symbolist poets, Maurice Maeterlinck, who, of course, was he was a Nobel Prize winner in 1911. He was given the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he epitomizes really symbolist poetry. He was obsessed with death and indulged in morbidity, which is very much a symbolist trait. And I think the most famous piece of his writing is probably The Blue Bird, but some of you might remember him from the Vienna class, because he, of course, also wrote The Seven Princesses, which was the influence or the point of departure for Margaret MacDonald's wonderful Cesso panel for the Warndorfer Music Salon in 1902. So symbolism is very important in Brussels, but we of course also have an extraordinary flowering of Art Nouveau architecture in the city. On one hand, provide progressive, forward-looking, avant-garde Belgian artists with a platform to show their works. So they organized exhibitions, and they had this wonderful journal, L'Art Moderne, in which they published critiques and treatises and poetry, etc. So they had an artist's journal. So that was one aim, to promote members of the group. But they also were very keen to expose Belgian audiences to the best of European and American modern art. So here we again see this kind of internationalism that I was trying to talk about yesterday, this interconnecting network of progressive artists, designers, and architects who are in exchange with one another across the continents. Now, Les Vins is very interesting because they did not actually promulgate or push a very specific artistic program. But as I said yesterday, they were very much interested in bringing together the most promising, the most modern, the most of their own time artistic forces from Belgium and